A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't saying nothing. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a wind that knew nothing of forgiveness. A wind that scraped the hope from a man's bones and left him hollow. Caleb Thorne knew that wind. It was the only companion he'd had for 5 long years on this unforgiving stretch of land. A constant whisper of what he'd lost. He stood on the railway platform, his brother Elias beside him, 2 sides of the same worn coin. They were twins, identical in the hard set of their jaws and the weathered lines around their eyes, but different in the silence they kept. Elias's silence was one of practicality, of a man who saw no use in words when a day's work spoke for itself. Caleb's was a deeper, colder thing. It was the silence of a tomb. They were waiting for the 3:10 train, the one carrying their future from a catalog. 2 mail-order brides. A sensible solution proposed by Elias to the crushing loneliness of their homestead. A man needs a wife. A home needs a woman's touch, Elias had said, his voice flat and certain. Caleb hadn't argued. He hadn't felt enough to argue. He just nodded, the motion as weary as the slump of his shoulders. He didn't want a wife. He wanted the ghost on the hill to stop haunting his sleep. But he would do his duty by his brother. He would build a life, or at least the frame of one. The train's whistle was a shriek in the vast emptiness. It chugged into the station, a great black beast breathing steam into the frosty air. 2 women descended, their forms nearly identical, their faces pale and drawn under plain bonnets. Twins. The first shock was a quiet ripple between the brothers. They exchanged a look, a flicker of surprise in their shared gray eyes. The catalog had said nothing of sisters, let alone twins. But it was the second shock that struck Caleb like a physical blow. The first woman, her gaze fixed on the dusty planks of the platform, held the hand of a small child, a boy no older than 3, who clung to her worn skirt with a desperate grip. The second woman stood slightly in front of them, a protective shield, her eyes darting between the 2 stone-faced men, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. A child. The contract had been for 2 healthy women, willing to work and build a family. A child was a complication, a burden. Elias's jaw tightened. He took a half-step forward, his gaze hard, a question forming on his lips. But Caleb didn't hear it. He saw only the woman's exhaustion, the raw, concealed terror in her eyes, and the way the boy hid his face in the folds of her dress. He saw the biting wind stinging the child's rosy cheeks. A memory, sharp and blinding as a shard of glass, pierced the numbness in his chest. A different child, a different cold day, a tiny grave on a windswept hill. Before Elias could speak, before the moment could curdle into rejection, Caleb moved. He stepped past his brother, his movements deliberate, his shadow falling over the woman and the boy. She flinched, pulling the child closer. Her sister stiffened, ready for a fight she couldn't win. Caleb stopped a few feet from them. He looked at the woman with the child, her face a mask of weary resignation. She was waiting for the blow, for the harsh words that would send her back to whatever hell she'd fled. He saw the trembling in her hand. He saw everything. The woman spoke first, her voice a raw whisper, aimed at the ground. I ain't saying nothing. Just don't send me back, Caleb swallowed. The sound was loud in the sudden stillness. He looked from her tired face to the top of the boy's head, then back again. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. He gave a single, curt nod. Then he turned to his brother, his expression unreadable but final. He picked up one of their trunks. Elias watched him, his own surprise warring with a lifetime of trusting his twin's judgment. He hesitated for a breath, then bent and picked up the other. The decision was made. They were staying. The wagon ride back to the homestead was a study in silence, a heavy blanket woven from 4 different kinds of quiet. Elias's was the silence of calculation, his mind already turning over the logistics of 2 extra mouths, one of them small and unplanned for. He gripped the reins, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he could will a solution out of the dusty vastness. The sisters, Anya and Alara, were silent with the tense watchfulness of cornered animals. Alara sat ramrod straight, her arm a rigid bar around Anya's shoulders, her eyes missing nothing: the barren landscape, the weary set of the brothers' shoulders, the rifle resting in its scabbard by Caleb's leg. Her silence was a promise of protection. Anya's was the silence of exhaustion and fear. She held her son, Leo, on her lap, her body curved around his small form, her chin resting on the top of his head. She stared at her own worn shoes, not daring to look at the men who now owned her future. She could feel their judgment like the cold seeping through her thin coat. She had broken the terms of the arrangement before it had even begun. She had deceived them. Her silence was a prayer for mercy. But it was Caleb's silence that dominated the small space of the wagon. It was an active, breathing thing, a presence as solid as the wooden seat beneath him. He didn't look at the women. He didn't look at his brother. He stared out at the passing landscape of rock and sagebrush, but his eyes weren't seeing it. He was seeing a ghost, a small hand that used to fit in his, a lullaby lost to the wind. The arrival of the child had cracked open a door inside him he had nailed shut 5 years ago. Through the crack, the cold grief was beginning to seep in again. He endured it. When the homestead finally came into view, a stark cabin and a barn hunkered down against the vast, slate evening sky, Alara's posture became even more rigid. It wasn't much, a testament to hard work and little comfort. The smoke rising from the stone chimney was the only sign of warmth. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the sounds were unnaturally loud. The jingle of the harness, the thud of the brothers' boots hitting the dirt, the soft whicker of a horse. Elias moved to the back of the wagon. "We're here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He lifted the trunks down with an economy of motion, his face impassive. Caleb came to stand beside the wagon, his presence large and intimidating. Anya flinched when he reached up, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted Leo from her arms. The boy, startled, began to cry, a thin, weary sound. Anya scrambled down from the wagon, her hands outstretched. "Please." Caleb didn't look at her. He held the boy, his touch firm but not unkind, and waited for Anya to find her footing on the unsteady ground. He then passed the crying child back to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. She pulled back as if burned, clutching Leo to her chest and murmuring soft words in a language the brothers didn't understand. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A long wooden table and 4 chairs stood in the center, and 2 curtained-off alcoves suggested sleeping quarters. A cast-iron stove stood in a corner, its metal surface gleaming dully in the light from the single window. It was a man's space, functional and devoid of softness. Alara's eyes swept the room, assessing, planning. Anya just held her son, her body trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the strangeness, the sheer, raw fact of her new life. Elias gestured towards one of the curtained alcoves. "You'll take that one," he pointed to the other. "We're in there," he didn't elaborate. There was no need. The division was clear. They were 4 strangers, bound by a piece of paper and a desperate gamble, now separated by a thin piece of cloth. That first night, no one spoke during the meager supper of bread and salted pork. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin plates, the crackle of the fire, and Leo's soft, sleepy breaths as he dozed in Anya's arms. After eating, the women disappeared behind their curtain without a word. The brothers sat at the table long after, the smoky lamplight carving hollows into their faces. Finally, Elias broke the silence, his voice low. "A child, Caleb, it was not a question but a statement of a problem. A heavy, undeniable problem." Caleb stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. He thought of the extra food, the extra space, the extra burden. He thought of the way the boy's head had felt against his shoulder, a familiar, agonizing weight. "The land is hard," Elias continued, thinking aloud. Winter's coming. It ain't what we agreed to. Caleb remained silent. He picked up a tin cup of water, his movements slow, deliberate. He took a long drink, the metal cold against his lips. Then he set the cup down with a soft clink. He looked at his brother, his gaze direct and unwavering. We agreed to it when we didn't send them back. He stood up, his weary shoulders filling the doorway for a moment before he stepped outside into the biting wind. The conversation was over. She stayed. And with her, the boy. The past was here. The days that followed fell into a rigid, unspoken rhythm, a silent dance of four people orbiting the hard center of survival. Life on the homestead was a litany of chores, each one demanding and necessary. The sun rose, and with it the work began. The sun set, and with it came an exhausted, shared silence. Words were a currency they couldn't afford. There was wood to chop, water to haul, animals to feed, and the ever-present threat of the coming winter to prepare for. Elias and Caleb moved with the familiar efficiency of men who had worked side by side their entire lives. The rhythmic thud of Caleb's axe splitting logs was the homestead's heartbeat, a steady percussion from dawn until dusk. He chopped wood deep into the night, long after the chores were done, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. Elias was the planner, his movements precise as he repaired the barn roof, checked their stores of flour and salt, and oiled the traps for the winter fur season. He was a man who found comfort in tangible tasks, in problems that could be solved with his hands. The women found their own rhythm within the cabin's four walls. Alara, with her sharp, observant eyes, took over the management of their meager supplies. She was fiercely competent, her hands always busy, mending the brothers' worn shirts with neat, tiny stitches, kneading dough for the daily bread, scrubbing the floorboards until the wood was pale and clean. She worked with a contained energy, a quiet fury, as if she could build a fortress of order against the chaos of their circumstances. Anya was quieter, her movements less certain. Her primary focus was Leo. She created a small world for him in their corner of the cabin, a nest of blankets where he could play with a carved piece of wood and a collection of smooth stones. When he slept, she helped Alara, her hands moving deftly as she learned the chores of this new life. She was a ghost at the edge of the room, unobtrusive and silent, but her presence softened the cabin's hard edges. She would sometimes hum a low, sad lullaby to Leo, the sound so soft it was barely audible above the whisper of the wind outside. The men and women rarely interacted directly. A nod was a greeting. A plate of food placed on the table was a conversation. A sharpened axe left by the woodpile was a statement of intent. They were for separate islands, the air between them thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated mistrust. Anya and Alara saw the brothers as their masters, unpredictable forces who held their fate in their hands. Every gesture was scrutinized. Was the extra piece of bacon left on the plate an act of kindness or a test? Was the silence a sign of acceptance or simmering resentment? Caleb was the most unnerving of all. He barely seemed to see them. He moved through the homestead like a shadow, his face a granite mask. But sometimes, Anya would catch him watching Leo, just for a second. His gaze would be distant, filled with a raw, suppressed pain that made her stomach clench with a strange mix of fear and sympathy. He never smiled. He never spoke to the boy, but his eyes followed him. It was a form of haunting. The brothers, for their part, saw the women as a disruption, a mystery. Elias viewed them with a practical wariness. They were efficient workers, and for that he was grudgingly grateful. But he didn't understand their whispered conversations, their shared glances, their impenetrable sisterly bond. He saw them as a responsibility he had to bear. Caleb's perception was more complicated. In Anya, he saw not just a woman, but a reflection of his own failure. Her quiet dignity in the face of hardship was a constant, painful reminder of the wife he couldn't save. In Leo, he saw the ghost of his daughter, a wound that refused to scar over. He kept his distance because getting closer felt like tempting a fate that had already destroyed him once. He built a wall of silence around himself. It was the only way he knew how to survive. One afternoon, Leo tripped and fell near the woodpile where Caleb was working. The boy let out a sharp cry of pain. Anya rushed out of the cabin, her face pale with alarm. Caleb froze, his axe held mid-swing. He stared at the crying child, his body rigid, his knuckles white on the handle. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched as Anya knelt and scooped her son into her arms, murmuring to him, checking his scraped knee. She shot a quick, fearful glance at Caleb, as if expecting him to be angry at the interruption. He turned away, his jaw tight, and brought the axe down with a vicious crack, splitting a thick log in two. He didn't offer help. He didn't offer comfort. He just returned to his work. But for the rest of the day, the sound of the axe was harder, more frantic. It was the sound of a man at war with himself. The distance remained. The first frost coated the land in a brittle layer of silver, a beautiful and stark warning. The cold was deepening, seeping through the chinks in the cabin walls, a reminder of their shared vulnerability. It was in this growing cold that the first tentative cracks appeared in the wall of silence. The gestures were small, almost invisible, born in the secret hours of the night when guilt and loneliness were at their most potent. They were interventions made under the cover of darkness, offerings left without expectation of thanks, because thanks would require words, and words were still too dangerous. Caleb was the first to act, driven by a ghost he could not exorcise. He had seen Anya trying to fashion a place for Leo to sleep, a small mound of hay stuffed into a burlap sack, placed on the cold floor in the corner of their alcove. It was a pathetic defense against the drafts that snaked across the floorboards. The sight lodged in his chest like a splinter. One night, long after the cabin had fallen into a heavy, exhausted sleep, he slipped out to the barn. In a dusty corner, buried beneath old harnesses and a stiff canvas tarp, was a small wooden cradle. His cradle, the one he had built with his own hands for a future that had turned to dust. His first instinct was to burn it, to destroy the last relic of his broken heart. But he couldn't. Instead, with a weary sigh that plumed in the frosty air, he dragged it into the small workshop adjoining the barn. For the next 3 nights, while the others slept, he worked by the light of a single smoky lamp. He sanded down the rough wood, tightened the joints, and replaced a broken rocker. His large, calloused hands, so used to the brute force of an axe, moved with a surprising, tender precision. On the final night, he took out his carving knife. He hesitated, the metal clinking on tin as he set down his lamp. Then, slowly, he began to carve a small, simple bird into the headboard. It wasn't perfect. It was the rough, honest work of a man who spoke better with wood than with words. Before dawn, he carried the finished cradle into the cabin and placed it silently in the alcove where the burlap sack had been. He laid a folded, clean wool blanket inside, one of his own. Then he retreated to his own side of the curtain, his heart a dull, aching drum in his chest. When Anya woke, the first thing she saw was the cradle. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She crept closer, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She ran a trembling hand over the smooth wood, her fingers tracing the outline of the tiny, carved bird. It was an impossible kindness, a silent apology, a question. She looked toward the men's curtain, her eyes wide with a dawning, fragile hope. She didn't know who had done it, but she knew it was a message. You are seen. The boy is seen. He is not just a burden. That day, something shifted in her. She still didn't speak to Caleb, but when she passed him his plate at supper, her fingers didn't recoil from a potential touch. She let them linger for a fraction of a second. A silent thank you. Elias, too, was making his own quiet overtures. He was a practical man, and his kindness was practical. He noticed the threadbare state of the women's dresses, clothing not meant for the harsh realities of a Dakota winter. On his next trip to the settlement for supplies, he did something uncharacteristic. He spent a few extra coins on a bolt of dark blue calico fabric and a spool of thick white thread. He didn't present it as a gift. He simply left the parcel on the main table when he returned, unpacking the flour and salt around it as if it were just another provision. Alara found it. She unrolled the fabric, her normally stern face softening for a moment. The cloth was sturdy, warm. It was an acknowledgement of their presence, of their needs. It was a gesture of provision, a silent contract that went beyond the original agreement. That evening, the soft snip of her scissors and the rhythmic prick of her needle joined the crackle of the fire. She was making a new, warmer dress for Anya and a proper blanket for Leo. She was stitching them into the fabric of this place. The brothers never mentioned the cradle or the cloth. The sisters never offered verbal thanks. But the air in the cabin began to change. The oppressive weight of silence was lessening, replaced by a quiet space of mutual observation. It was not yet trust, but it was the beginning of the possibility of it. A fragile seed planted in frozen ground. The blizzard arrived without warning, a monstrous white wall that descended from the slate sky and swallowed the world whole. One moment, the landscape was a study in brown and gray. The next, it was a churning vortex of snow and wind. The sound was a deafening roar, a physical pressure against the small cabin, which groaned and shuddered under the assault. The world shrank to the dimensions of their four walls, the fire, and the howling darkness outside. For 3 days they were prisoners together. The enforced proximity stripped away the fragile routines that had kept them separate. There was no escaping to the barn, no losing oneself in the rhythm of chopping wood. There was only the cramped space, the flickering lamplight, and the four of them, forced to navigate the small, charged territory of the cabin. The tension was palpable. Every accidental brush of shoulders, every shared glance across the table, was magnified. But it wasn't just tension. In the shared struggle against the storm, a new dynamic began to emerge. Elias and Alara found a common language in competence. While the storm raged, they worked as a team, their movements efficient and synchronized. He checked the integrity of the doorframe, stuffing rags into the cracks where the wind shrieked through. She methodically inventoried their food supplies, calculating how long they could last. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, two practical souls recognizing a kindred spirit. They were anchors in the chaos. The bond forming between Caleb and Anya was quieter, more fraught, and born of fear. On the second night of the blizzard, Leo developed a cough. By morning, it had settled deep in his chest, and a fever burned on his small forehead. He became listless, his breathing shallow and ragged. Anya was consumed by a quiet, desperate terror. She held him, rocking him, sponging his face with a cool cloth, her face a mask of anguish. She felt utterly helpless, a mother watching her child slip away in this desolate, frozen wasteland. She sent pleading, terrified glances toward the men, but what could they do? Elias looked on with a grim, useless sympathy. But Caleb, who had been sitting by the fire, staring into the flames as if in a trance, suddenly stirred. The boy's labored breaths were a sound he knew too well. It was the sound that had haunted his nightmares for 5 years. He stood up, his large frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He walked over to Anya, his face grim. "Let me see him," he said. His voice was rough, a rasp of sound in the roaring silence.
Anya flinthead, clöncsin Leo tighter.
Her first instinct was fear. This severe, silent man. What did he want? Alara moved to her sister's side, a protective shadow. Caleb ignored them both. He knelt, his knees cracking, and gently touched Leo's forehead. The heat was familiar. The shallow breathing, the faint blue tinge to the boy's lips. It was a map of a road he had traveled before. "There's herbs," he said, his voice low and urgent. "In the barn." For lung fever, Elias stared at him. "You can't go out in that. It's suicide." "I have to," Caleb said, his gaze locked on the sick child. It wasn't a choice. It was a penance. He pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around his face, his movements swift and determined. He grabbed the rope by the door. "Tie the other end to the post," he ordered Elias. "I'll follow it back," and then he was gone, swallowed by the white fury. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Anya rocked her son, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Alara stood by the window, peering into the swirling snow, her face taut with anxiety. Even Elias paced, his practical calm shattered. When Caleb finally stumbled back through the door, he was a creature of ice and snow, his beard frozen, his breathing harsh. But clutched in his raw, red hand was a small leather pouch. He collapsed on the floor, exhausted, but pushed the pouch toward Anya. Boil them in water. Make him breathe the steam. He didn't have the strength to do more. While Alara and Elias helped him out of his frozen clothes, rubbing life back into his hands, Anya followed his instructions. She worked with trembling fingers, her hope a tiny, flickering candle against the storm of her fear. For the rest of that day and through the long night, Caleb sat with her. He didn't speak much. He just stayed. When Leo would start to cough, a racking, terrible sound, Caleb would show Anya how to hold him, how to pat his back to loosen the congestion. He brought her water. He added wood to the fire. He was a steady, quiet presence in her storm of fear. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. Leo's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. His small hand curled around Anya's finger. Anya watched him, tears of relief streaming silently down her face. She looked up at Caleb, who sat slumped in a chair across from her, his face haggard in the dim light. Their eyes met. In his, she saw not the cold, distant stranger, but a man hollowed out by a grief as deep as her own. She saw the ghost of the child he had tried to save before, and he saw in her eyes not fear or suspicion, but a profound, heartbreaking gratitude, a fragile, unspoken forgiveness. The storm outside had begun to quiet. The storm inside had finally broken. The blizzard receded as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world transformed. The landscape was a vast, unbroken canvas of white, beautiful and treacherous. The sun a pale, watery disk in a clean-swept sky. The silence that descended was profound, a stark contrast to the howling rage of the storm. Inside the cabin, a new kind of quiet had settled as well, one less of tension and more of contemplation. The shared ordeal had redrawn the lines between them. They were no longer four strangers. They were survivors. But survival required supplies. Their stores had been depleted by the long confinement, and a trip to the nearest settlement, a place charitably called Redemption, was unavoidable. Elias deemed the snow packed enough for the sled. The decision was made that Caleb and Anya would go. Elias needed to stay to repair a section of the barn roof that had buckled under the snow, and Alara would not leave Leo, who was still weak but steadily recovering. The pairing was unspoken but logical. Caleb was the strongest, and Anya needed to purchase medicine and softer food for her son. The journey into town was slow, the horses struggling through the deep drifts. Anya sat beside Caleb, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe. The silence between them was different now. It was filled not with mistrust, but with the memory of a shared vigil in the dead of night. It was a comfortable wait. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, now a muddy track of melted snow, lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. As they pulled up to the store, heads turned. The Thorne brothers were known as reclusive, hard men who kept to themselves. The sight of Caleb with a woman, a stranger with tired eyes and a plain dress, was an event. Whispers followed them as they stepped onto the boardwalk, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. Anya felt the stares like a physical touch, and she instinctively pulled her shawl tighter, lowering her gaze. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and chewing tobacco. A group of men loitered by the pot-bellied stove, their conversation halting as Caleb and Anya entered. Among them was Silas Croft, a broad-shouldered man with a prosperous gut and small, calculating eyes. Croft owned the largest ranch in the county and held the mortgage on half the homesteads, a position that fed his arrogance. He had tried to buy the Thorne brothers' land for years, coveting their access to the creek, and their refusal was a constant irritant to him. He saw his chance to needle them. Well, Thorne," Croft boomed, his voice oozing false geniality. "Finally decided to civilize yourself? Where'd you find this one?" Caleb ignored him, moving toward the counter with a list. But Croft wasn't so easily dismissed. He stepped forward, blocking Anya's path. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Catalog woman, ain't she?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you and your brother ordered a matched set. But they didn't mention this one came with baggage." He nodded pointedly toward the medicine Anya was asking the storekeeper for. "Or did you get a discount for damaged goods?" The other men snickered. The storekeeper looked away, suddenly busy arranging cans on a shelf. Anya froze, humiliation washing over her in a hot, sickening wave. The insult was public, brutal. She lowered her gaze to the floorboards, her face burning, her whole body trembling. She felt worthless, exposed, a piece of property being discussed. All the fragile hope she had been nursing withered under the heat of his contempt. The child, who had been a source of terror and then salvation, was now a mark of shame. She just wanted to disappear. Caleb had been standing with his back to them. At Croft's words, his shoulders went rigid. For a long moment he didn't move. The entire store held its breath. Anya expected him to walk away, to leave her to this humiliation. It was his right. She was his problem, his bad bargain. But then he turned. Slowly. He didn't look at Croft. He looked at Anya. He saw her lowered head, her trembling hands, the utter desolation in her posture. And in that moment the last of his own defenses crumbled. He saw not a stranger, not a burden, but a woman of quiet dignity being torn apart by the cruelty of the world. A world that had taken everything from him, too. He stepped forward, placing himself between Anya and Silas Croft. He was not a tall man, but his presence was immense, rooted in the earth. He was silent but firm, a wall of pure, unyielding resolve. Croft's smirk faltered slightly. "Something to say, Thorne?" Caleb's voice, when it came, was low and clear, devoid of anger but carrying the weight of an oath. Cut through the thick silence of the store. He reached out and gently, deliberately, took Anya's hand. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. He held her hand firmly in his. He looked directly at Silas Croft. "She's with me," he said. Then he paused, letting the words settle. "Not bought. Chosen." The crowd fell silent. The words hung in the air, simple, powerful, and irrefutable. It was a declaration, a claiming, not of ownership but of partnership, of protection. Croft, flustered and outmaneuvered, could only stammer, his blustering authority punctured. Caleb held his gaze for another beat, then turned, still holding Anya's hand, and led her from the store. Outside in the pale winter sun, the cold air felt clean. As he helped her onto the sled, Anya began to cry, silent, racking sobs of relief and a gratitude so profound it felt like pain. He didn't try to comfort her with words. He just stood there, his hand resting on her shoulder, a steady presence, until she was done. He stayed. The journey back to the homestead was as quiet as the one into town, but the quality of the silence had undergone a seismic shift. It was no longer a space to be endured, but a sanctuary. Caleb held the reins, his eyes on the trail, but his awareness was entirely focused on the woman beside him. He could still feel the fragile tremor of her hand in his, the warmth of it against his calloused skin. The words he had spoken in the store echoed in his own mind. Not bought, chosen. He had said them to protect her, to silence Croft. But as he drove the sled through the endless white, he realized they were the truest words he had spoken in 5 years. He had chosen this. He had chosen her. He had chosen the small boy sleeping soundly back in the cabin. He had chosen to feel again, and the choice was both terrifying and liberating. Anya sat wrapped in the buffalo robe, her tears dried, leaving salty tracks on her cold cheeks. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. The sneering face of Silas Croft, the suffocating shame, and then Caleb. The way he had stepped in front of her, a shield against the world's contempt. The way his voice, so rarely used, had rung with an undeniable authority. But most of all, She remembered the feeling of his hand closing around hers. It was the first time a man had touched her with pure, uncomplicated kindness, without wanting something in return. It was a touch that said, "You are not alone. You are worthy of defense." It was a touch that had begun to mend something deep inside her that she thought was irrevocably broken. When they arrived back at the homestead, the sun was setting, painting the snow in hues of pink and lavender. Elias and Alara came out to meet them, their faces etched with worry. Alara's eyes immediately went to her sister, searching for any sign of distress. Anya gave her a small, watery smile, a reassurance that went beyond words. That evening, after a quiet supper, a new routine was broken. Instead of retreating to their separate corners, they lingered. Elias and Alara spoke in low tones by the fire, discussing the repairs to the barn. Their conversation was practical, grounded, the talk of two people building a future together, brick by brick. A partnership was forming there, too, built on mutual respect and shared labor. Caleb found himself on the small porch, leaning against a post, staring out at the vast, star-dusted sky. The air was frigid, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt calm. The door creaked open behind him, and Anya stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. She stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. For a long time, they stood in silence, listening to the whisper of the wind in the pines. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft as falling snow. "For what you did today." He didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. He knew she wasn't just talking about the store. She was talking about the cradle, about the blizzard, about everything. The confession came to him then, not as a decision, but as a necessity. The wall he had built around his heart had been breached, and the story had to come out. "There's a grave," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Two of them. On that hill over there." He didn't need to point. She knew the one. A small, lonely rise set apart from the rest. "My wife, Sarah, and our little girl." "Rose," he said the names as if they were stones in his mouth, heavy and sharp. "It was a fever. Came on fast. Just like your boys." His voice cracked on the last words. I couldn't save them. The doctor was a day's ride away. By the time I got back, it was too late." He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight, she could see the raw, unconcealed grief in his eyes. The guilt he had carried alone for 5 years. It was all there. "When I saw you," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "standing on that platform with Leo, I saw them, and I couldn't turn away again." Anya listened, her heart aching for him, for the terrible weight he had borne in silence. She finally understood the depth of his sorrow, the source of his impenetrable quiet. It wasn't hardness. It was a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. The wool of his coat was rough beneath her palm. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. A current of understanding, of shared sorrow and nascent comfort, passed between them. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, allowing the first touch of genuine human solace he had felt in half a decade. Her hand on his arm. They were no longer alone in their pain. A fragile bridge had been built across the chasm of their silence. From the window, Alara watched them, a small, knowing smile on her face. She looked at Elias, who was watching them too. He met her gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. A new season was coming. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, protracted battle against the retreating winter. The snow melted into a sea of mud, the creek swelled its banks, and the wind still carried a bitter chill. But there were signs of change, of life stubbornly reasserting itself. Patches of green appeared on the south-facing slopes, the buds on the cottonwood trees grew fat and sticky, and the birds returned, their songs a tentative but welcome intrusion into the long-held silence. The homestead, too, was undergoing a transformation. The change was most visible in the physical structure of the place. With the ground finally thawed, Elias and Caleb began laying the foundation for an extension to the cabin. The work was hard, a daily grind of felling trees, hewing logs, and fitting them together. But now they were not just building a shelter, they were building a home. The work was a shared project, a testament to a future they were all improbably beginning to believe in. Elara, with Elias's help, tilled a small patch of ground near the cabin for a garden. Her practical nature found its truest expression in the neat rows she planned for potatoes, beans, and corn. She and Elias often worked side by side, their conversation sparse but meaningful, a comfortable exchange of knowledge about soil, seeds, and seasons. Theirs was a love story written in the earth, a bond forged in the shared goal of making something grow in this hard land. Inside the expanding cabin, the atmosphere had lightened beyond recognition. The oppressive quiet was gone, replaced by the sounds of a life being lived. Leo's laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed through the rooms. He was a healthy, curious boy, and he toddled after Caleb with a relentless devotion, his small hand often tucked into Caleb's large one. Caleb, in turn, had slowly, cautiously, let the boy into his walled-off heart. He would spend hours with him by the creek, teaching him how to skip stones, his face softening in a way Anya had never thought possible. He was carving a small wooden horse for him, the shavings falling at his feet like shed layers of his old grief. Anya's voice was the truest measure of the change. The low, sad lullabies she used to hum had been replaced by actual songs, tunes from a life before sorrow, sung as she kneaded bread or mended clothes. Her smile, once a fleeting, ghost-like thing, now appeared more frequently, illuminating her face with a quiet warmth. She and Caleb had found a new rhythm, one of gentle gestures and shared glances. They didn't need many words. A look across the dinner table was enough to convey a whole conversation. A touch of his hand on the small of her back as she passed by the stove was a promise. Their connection was a quiet, deep-rooted thing, like a river that runs silently beneath the ground. One afternoon, as Anya was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two young pines, she watched the three people who had become her world. Elara and Elias were bent over their garden plot, their heads close together as they examined a sprouting seed. And Caleb was on the half-finished porch of the new extension, showing Leo how to stack small, flat rocks into a wobbly tower. The sound of the boy's delighted squeal when the tower tumbled carried on the breeze. A profound sense of peace settled over her. This place, which had once seemed like a prison at the edge of the world, had become a sanctuary. These people, who had been her silent, intimidating masters, had become her family. She had come here expecting a life of servitude and hardship. She had found hardship, yes, but she had also found acceptance, protection, and a love she never dared to imagine. She had found a home. Later that evening, as twilight settled, they all gathered on the porch. The air was cool but held the promise of summer warmth. Elias was smoking his pipe, a rare indulgence, and Elara sat beside him, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Anya sat in a chair Caleb had repaired for her, with Leo asleep in her lap. Caleb leaned against the railing, watching them, a look of quiet contentment on his face. He caught Anya's eye and gave her a small, genuine smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the weathered corners. It transformed his entire face, wiping away the last shadows of the haunted man he had been. He didn't know it when she first arrived on that train platform, a desperate woman with a secret child, but his salvation had stood right before him. He had thought he was offering her a refuge, but it was she, with her quiet strength and her son's innocent trust, who had offered one to him. She had led him out of the winter of his grief. The homestead was thriving. The family was growing. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of peace. From the dust and silence of a desolate land, something new and resilient had taken root. From the closed-off hearts of four lonely people, a family had unexpectedly grown. This was not a story of grand passions or heroic deeds fought in the public square. It was a quieter, more profound tale of how human connection can be rediscovered in the most unforgiving of circumstances. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most important words are the ones never spoken, conveyed instead through a repaired cradle, a bolt of cloth, or a hand offered in a moment of public shame. Caleb and Elias Thorne sought wives to fill the emptiness of their homestead, a practical solution to a practical problem. They expected duty, labor, and perhaps, in time, a sterile sort of companionship. They did not expect to have their hearts broken open and remade. They did not expect to find love. Anya and Alara sought refuge, a desperate escape from a past that offered them nothing but judgment and poverty. They expected a life of hard work and submission, a trade of one kind of prison for another. They did not expect to find partners. They did not expect to find men who would see their true worth, not as damaged goods, but as women of immense strength and dignity. They did not expect to find a home. In the vast, uncaring wilderness, away from the prying eyes and cruel tongues of a world that had discarded them, they found each other. They learned that a family is not something defined by blood or by contract, but something that is built, day by day, through shared struggle, quiet support, and the slow, patient work of healing each other's wounds. Love does not always announce itself with a thunderclap. Sometimes, it grows in the silence, where no one is looking. It is nurtured by small, consistent acts of kindness. It is the steady warmth of a fire on a cold night, the promise of a sprouting seed in the spring soil, the comfortable presence of another person who understands your sorrow without you having to name it. It is the realization that you are stronger together than you ever were apart. The world is full of noise, of loud declarations and empty promises. But true strength, true connection, is often found in the quiet places, in the deliberate and honest gestures that say, "I see you. I am here. You are safe." This homestead, once a monument to one man's grief, had become a testament to that truth. A place where for broken souls learned to be whole again, together. The seasons continued their relentless, steady turn. The vibrant green of summer deepened, then gave way to the gold and russet of autumn. The harvest from Alara and Elias's garden was bountiful, their root cellar filled to bursting, a tangible symbol of their shared labor and foresight. The extension on the cabin was completed, the new wood smelling of fresh-cut pine and promise. It was a proper house now, with separate rooms and space to breathe, a home that echoed with more laughter than it had ever known silence. Caleb had spent the long summer evenings on the porch, working on one final project. He was not a man of easy words, and he knew he would never be. His love was best expressed through the work of his hands, through the creation of things that were solid, reliable, and meant to last. He was carving a rocking chair from a beautiful piece of aged oak he had found deep in the woods. It was for Anya. It was his poem to her. Each smooth curve and sturdy joint a line in a verse about comfort, safety, and enduring love. On the first truly cold evening of autumn, when the air had the sharp, clean bite of coming snow, he brought it out onto the porch and set it beside her usual chair. He didn't say anything. He just placed it there. Anya came out a few moments later, a blanket in her arms to ward off the chill. She stopped when she saw the chair. It was beautiful, the wood glowing with a deep, warm luster in the lamplight spilling from the open doorway. The rockers were perfectly balanced, the back was high and supportive, and on the headrest, so small you would miss it if you weren't looking, was a carved bird, identical to the one on Leo's cradle. She ran her hand over the smooth, polished wood, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it left her breathless. She looked at him, her eyes shining. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking a little awkward, as if he'd just confessed his deepest secret, which, in a way, he had. She sat down in the rocker, and it moved with a gentle, soothing rhythm. Leo, now old enough to be a confident walker, came toddling out and climbed into her lap, snuggling against her. She wrapped the blanket around them both. Caleb sat in the chair beside her. Elias and Alara came to stand in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching the first few flakes of snow begin to drift down from the dark sky. The window to the main room was open, letting the warm, golden light and the smell of baking bread spill out onto the porch, a beacon against the encroaching night. They sat there for a long time, the five of them, a family forged in silence and hardship, watching the winter begin. It no longer held any terror for them. It was just another season, another turn of the wheel. They would face it together. Caleb reached over and took Anya's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. She leaned her head back against the carved bird and closed her eyes, a deep and peaceful contentment settling into her bones. He looked at her, then at the sleeping child in her arms, at his brother and the strong woman by his side, at the home they had all built. He finally felt the ghost on the hill settle into a peaceful rest. He was home. "Stay here," he whispered, the words meant for her, for all of them, for himself. She squeezed his hand. She would. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most.